In order to fully understand historical events, we have to understand the people who created history and profile them correctly without bias or personal opinion. As historians, we must see through the propaganda of war and rumors of the time. This is especially true when it comes to what could be called the father of modern propaganda, Dr. Joseph Goebbels. One of the leading people in the Third Reich, a person with an enormous influence and sway over the German people and of events, and at times over Hitler. He was far more than just the master of propaganda and information in the German Reich, as we shall eventually see. Many of the key leaders of the Third Reich we mainly know anything about only from post-war statements by those who had been around them or given by people who many times trying, as they were, to vindicate their own actions by tarring those now dead, or from trial transcripts designed to condemn them. However, several leading figures wrote an actual diary. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, wrote a true diary his entire life, one from which we can truly learn much about Himmler the man. And also Joseph Goebbels wrote a diary, however, possibly from a different perspective, later on in life at least. Himmler wrote his because he wanted to chronicle his life as his father had always told him. He did not write it with the intention that anybody should ever read it. However, when reading Joseph Goebbels' diary, it seems he eventually had in mind that somebody one day would read it, and he became throughout the Reich a famous and known figure with an eye on his own legacy. Thus, when we read his diary, we have to sometimes subtract the self-vindicating glorification, and we need to hold it up to the ethos and records of contemporary actions and supporting documents. Look for the rewrites and corrections he made on the pages, and keeping in mind that as war started, he began to dictate his entries to his secretary, thus perhaps losing the personal, intimate touch one would get with a diary. I get a feeling from time to time that Goebbels always had in mind that maybe one day Hitler himself might read it. As a military historian with a degree also in psychology and marketing, this was an especially interesting journey for me to study and break down the character of Joseph Goebbels, especially the earlier years that can be said to be a true reflection of the man and his endeavors and his inner conflicts and beliefs as they are reflected in his early diary writings. Joseph Goebbels was born in the Lower Rhineland on October 29th, 1897, in a traditional Catholic area and household. His father was Fritz Goebbels, a bookkeeper for Lennart's company. Joseph was named after a close family friend, Joseph, a Jewish lawyer. His mother, Katharina Maria Odenhausen, was the daughter of a Dutch blacksmith, a man that Goebbels held in great esteem until his death. He had two older brothers, Hans and Konrad, and three younger sisters. However, the first two would die young, but the third daughter, Maria, would always be greatly cherished by Joseph, and both of his brothers would benefit from his rise in the Third Reich many years later. Goebbels was always far closer to his mother than to his father. He was always wondered why his mother had married his father in the first place. As he would later write, their relationship was somewhat strained, but not in an extreme degree, although Fritz made notes of every dime he spent since his marriage to Maria. He would put Goebbels through some of the best schools he could. But Goebbels would always be beholden to his mother first. He was somewhat plagued by childhood bad health, starting with barely surviving pneumonia. But the worst was yet to come. His defining sickness was his foot. At age 7, he came down with crippling foot pains. The doctors were stumped as to why. Perhaps osteomyelitis. An operation left his foot even more crippled than before, and 3.5 centimeters shorter than the other. That leg also grew shorter in itself than the other one, and for a young man of the time, it was heartbreaking, and a defining event for the young Joseph. As one can imagine, he also grew slight in stature, and never, even as an adult, ever weighed much more than 100 pounds. But he was smart, and he took to book studies already as his aunt brought him books to the hospital, recovering from the botched operation. In 1908, Goebbels began gymnasium. In Reich, he got along well with his teachers, and especially the teacher of scripture, Father Johannes Mullen. He did not seem to have had many close friends, but there were 3, Hompesch, Benes, and Lenartz. Although his friends, Herbert Lenartz, died young during a minor operation, this was something that touched Joseph quite deeply, and an event that inspired him to write his very first poem. His physical deformities had initially left him apathic, but soon he became, and seemingly to compensate, through his studies, and would usually always be at the top of his classes. His parents wanted him to become a priest. They were both deeply religious Catholics, and the church would in turn pay for his higher education. This, however, was something we now know, of course, was not to be. In 1914, as with all his friends now signed up for the military service as World War I began, Goebbels too tried to sign up, however was immediately rejected, given his deformity. Inspiring his school essay, "How Can a Non-Combatant Help the Fatherland in These Times?" In it he argued that even those denied shedding their blood could be of service. One of his brothers who were serving ended up in French POW camp, and his friends would write him of their exploits at the front. And it got worse for the young Joseph. In 1915, one of his sisters died. He would write of the family kneeling in prayer around her as she went. These must have been trying times for the young man, a time of loss, and saddled with an inability to fight, left him a lifelong impression on the young Joseph. But on the other hand, in many ways, he showed some lack of interest in the war and politics at all in these early years, at least initially. His roaring interest in women outshined the war years far more in his writings. Yet in August 1917, he delivered the valedictorian speech after winning the best essay. He spoke of Germany's global mission to become the political and spiritual leader in the world, and his headmaster noted it was a very good speech, but that he would never become a great orator. Something later events would certainly prove wrong. His painful deformity left him out of the front line, and thus stuck in education, and this gave him an intellectual advantage. However, as opposed to his future comrades such as Hitler, Goering, Hess, and many more, who did not have time to further their education as they were fighting in France. He expanded his horizons by studying Latin and history. Also, his father had in 1909 purchased a piano, and with it a sign of a solid middle-class home. He was contemplating the priesthood, perhaps even medicine, but his teacher, Herr Voss, persuaded him to get into literature and its studies at the University of Bonn. Perhaps conscious of his deformity, he would not date much initially. His diary entry speaks of infatuations with some of the women around him. He had, from the age 18, a 3-year infatuation with a girl named Lena Krage. He would call it love, and one night in the park he got what most Americans would refer to as second base, noting in his diary how she had become a loving woman. However, seems like these encounters were the closest thing he would get to an actual sexual relationship with a woman until the age of 33. He left Lena for Bonn the next day, and he wondered often in his diary where it could have gone had he remained. 7 years later, he would still note her name from time to time. In universities, he would join a Catholic fraternity, Unitas in 1917. He was also admitted to military service in the sense that he served a few weeks as a clerk with the Home Auxiliary Service that year. Yet his funds in Bonn was running out. He wanted to continue university, but his father could only send 50 marks a month. Joseph earned a little by tutoring, but not much, and what he did he spent on holidays with Lena, with whom he spent one night, whereafter she still had remained pure, as he noted on the pages of his diary. In the winter of 1917, he submitted a formal application to the Diocese of Cologne, where the Albertus Magnus Society provided aid to young promising Catholics. In support, his scripture teacher wrote in support of his application, "Herr Goebbels comes from a decent Catholic parents, and deserves commendation for his religious fervor, and his general moral demeanor." After the war, Father Mullen would tell how Joseph had been a promising young scholar, who for 9 years had taken scripture lessons and always had shown much interest and devotion. Also, the priest in Reich supported him in his endeavors. The Church Society agreed he was a worthy cause and loaned him 964 Reichsmarks, interest-free, so he could continue his studies in Bonn. By the time he would take his final PhD exam, he would have attended 5 different universities. This was not unusual, as he sought different classes with different teachers, and at times he was chasing one girl or another, and at times particular university dorms were simply full. But by now his close friends, Hompesch, had begun to refer to him jokingly as Motor Mouth, already then, and from letters it comes out that his oratory skills had greatly improved. However, financial difficulties were one of the recurring themes he would have until he eventually became Gauleiter of Berlin, but that was long in the future. He would find himself caught up with infatuations with several girls, charging him to change different directions from time to time, change his focus from time to time as well. He would, throughout his life, let himself be distracted by women around him, causing him much trouble throughout his life. He seemed to be quite emotionally driven, and despite his physical appearance, he would manage through his words to ingrace himself with quite a few women. Yet for some reason, an actual relationship always seemed beyond him. Yet, able to be the center of numerous dramas already then, and over Christmas in 1918, that year one of his friend's sisters, Agnes, caught his eye, and one night they found themselves passionately kissing on the sofa. She introduces him to her sister Liesel, and another point of a triangle begins, and lasts into the new year. In his diary he duly noted this interesting pursuit of the 2 girls, and nights spent where he again specifically notes much kissing of breasts, something he seems to have duly noted with a certain smugness. However, noting how they were all still just kids, and soon after he leaves to begin university in Freiburg with his school friend Kolosch, who introduces him to a very special girl, 2 years older than Goebbels, Anka Stahlem, a blonde, beautiful student here. Her father owns a distillery, and she has even studied abroad. She is one of those rare women who commands the interest of every man in any room, and Joseph and his friends, too, strikes up friendly rivalry for her attention. She studies archaeology. Joseph joins her class also. Anka seems fascinated by his intellect, also spends much time, however, with his friend, much to his torment, however. She is also of a far higher social standing than Joseph is, and seems quite well aware, as she does not introduce him to her brother as he visits town. How intimate they became seems a little unclear still, but she was also seeking his affection, as he noted in his diary. However, no matter how much piano playing and serenading he does, he notes she is chastity herself. But as it is with all things romantic, entanglements come to an end, and she eventually left town, leaving him behind. Yet, with countless letters later flung between the two, he was clearly infatuated by her, sometimes writing her several times a day even. Her family was not impressed with him at all, nor did they approve of the possible liaison between the two. Now Joseph, having returned home and still in touch with his former lady friend there, Agnes, with whom he's always kept in contact. However, he made no secrets of his new love for Anka, displaying a clear sense of insensitivity at this game. He had also begun to write his first 5-act play, called Judas Iscariot, one the clergy did not approve of at all, directing him to destroy all copies of it. He does not, however, as it is later found, among his papers. But this is the first beginning of a crack between Joseph and the church, not helped at all by Anka's mother refusing them to study at the same university that next year. Now, in the midst of Joseph's focus on women, on Anka, his play, and his studies, but his interest in the ongoing war seems negligible, and once his older brother Conrad accuses him of not taking any interest in the war and making him at least promise to read the dispatches. In Anka's letters, she told him and scolds him on his puritanical views. She even later mocks his stern morals. In his letters to her, he writes that love is to be both physical and spiritual in order to be fulfilled. He is still hoping her mother will relent and allow them to study together in this coming year, and upon learning she had signed up to the University of Würzburg, he does the same. Happy to be near her, he dives into the studies of German literature as well as ancient and modern history. Goebbels barely notices the armistice, yet with the retreating troops and the establishment of occupational zones, it could hardly avoid his attention, nor could the fact that now communists were rampaging through Bavaria. Even his parents urges him to come home for safety. Yet he wants to remain near Anka, including missing the Christmas choir for the first time. They spend nights together, but it is apparent that they are not intimate. One could perhaps sense a slight maternal feeling from her towards him, being several years younger. At this time of the German people, he writes, one day they will yearn for intellectual and spiritual values rather than those of brute mob appeal. New elections were called for by the new German government in 1919, and he makes note of feeling strengthened after hearing his old teacher speak out for the new Democratic Party. He's delighted that school friends voted for the Center Catholic Party, or the German Nationalist Party, to whom he seemingly leaned, citing, "Thank God there are still Germans in the German fatherland." He eventually does return home through railway stations clogged with British occupational troops, and having to wait for his travel pass. The restrictions within the frontier regions of Germany now makes it harder for them to travel and see each other. As he meets her in Freiburg, she confesses to having had sexual relations with his friends Kolosch. But he forgives this indiscretion readily, and later, in 1924, makes a note in his diary that she truly was a divine female, but they would destroy each other if they were ever married. Yet his love for her never seemed to wane, and they would still travel and see each other for a long time to come. Something more telling about the future Gauleiter of Berlin are his notes of interesting conversations he had carried with those that could be considered of lower classes. One might feel an almost anti-bourgeois sentiment, and he would read both Marx and Engels. He was now opening sentiments on socialism and sympathies for the lower classes and the uneducated. He studied Goethe, and slowly his anti-religious beliefs crept up in his writings. Also, he was noticing the turmoil around him in Germany. Yet he would borrow money for short trips with Anka. Also, he started writing a novel, the novel of his life, with her as the heroine. On one trip they paused in Frankfurt to visit Goethe's house, but he makes a note. Why waste time in this Jewish city? Yet, as of now, there are still very few traces in his writings of his later notorious anti-Semitism. He writes that it would be highly unworthy and ignorant to get rid of Jews by pogroms. He wrote Anka how he could not stand the exaggerated anti-Semitism, and this at a time where both he and her had to sell or pawn their watches. He would bury himself in studies of art, music, and history, and dramatic readings. He received one of the last loans from the Catholic Charity, and despite his years of studies of theology, his allegiances were slowly turning away from the Church. He wrote novels in which the characters lived through his own turmoil. It now seems he felt the oppressiveness of the Catholic Church and the illustrious priests, and in 1919 he would leave his student fraternity, and letters to his father spoke of how his faith wavered, but that he had not yet compromised his morals. And according to his scripture teacher Johannes Mollen, he continued to speak at Catholic conclaves and remained in touch with him for many years following. Goebbels studied Dostoevsky, and now with the tutelage of Herr Friesler, a disillusioned family friend and war veteran, he slowly became more politically aware and began turning to the left. Remember, Goebbels wrote quite a few books and plays giving away some of his initial political leanings, and after Kurt Eisner, the German communist leader, was assassinated, Joseph sketched out another book, The Seed. He tried to obtain a teaching position both in East Prussia as well as in Holland. He did speak a little Dutch after his mother. During the Christmas of 1919, he was prevented from going home to see his family by the occupying Allied forces, and this gives us some insight in how the Allied occupations of the German border areas affected Germans, and we must take this into account when seeking to understand the changing mindset of the German people. After having failed at obtaining a teaching position, he decided to go for his PhD in Heidelberg. But in 1919, one can only picture his lone figure on the streets of Munich on Christmas Eve as he found himself standing outside a house, cold in the snow, listening as a family father who was playing Schubert for his family, citing from his diary. His deep feelings for Anka is unmistakable, and in return she certainly seemed to have loved him also. Yet it was coming to the time of the relationship's twilight. He was a penniless writer, and her a somewhat better-off daughter of an industrialist. He tried to read to her from his new book, The Seed, but its left-leaning sentiments did not wear on her at all, as in return her bourgeois sentiments now tired on him. They were drifting apart, fighting, and had become unhappy. He convinces her to study elsewhere than at Heidelberg, where he was to begin, and regretting it soon after. He officially asks for an engagement, unless she feels herself not ready. She, of course, turns him down, something it seems he must have expected, given the circumstances. But as he returns home, he appears to have suffered a nervous breakdown. He writes his final testament, describing how his things are to be distributed to his friends or sold to settle his debts. In his letter he states how he is tired of life, and that Miss Anka was to burn his letters and not to brood over his death but be happy. It seems suicide was on his mind, as he folds the letter into an envelope and leaves it there, but as we know, takes no further action. He and Anka remains in sporadic contact, but she eventually becomes engaged to someone else, 5 years her senior, and in a significantly better financial situation than the young Goebbels. Still, upon hearing the news, he is heartbroken, and she in turn writes him how unhappy she was, writing that nobody would ever love her like he did. Yet the dies were cast, As he noted in his diary, Anka walked away from me, and my entire relationship with women has suffered ever since. He would even, at this time, borrow money to send one of his friends to spy on her, but to no avail. He would, in 1921, after an extra term, submit his paper for his 215-page doctorate, dedicating it to his proud parents, and upon the final examination passed and returned home, now with the title of Herr Doktor. As for Anka, her fiancé threatened with legal action if he would not stop pestering her. Much to the dismay of his parents, Goebbels spent the next 4 years doing very little, lying about the house, reading, while squandering what little he had earned from tutoring. All the while, Germany was speeding up its decline all around him. The economy was faltering, right and left-wing parties fighting for power. Yet it seemed he was quite indifferent to the events around him and showed little interest in politics. He would still later make claims of having influenced the party platform, or having advised Hitler and even led a resistance movement in the war. However, all were quite untrue, as the first reference to Hitler in his writings was in 1923, and all it said was, Hitler, Bavaria. He also did not join the party until 1925. Still, in his writings there are sporadic mentions of girls' names, but nothing deeper. He wrote several articles for newspapers and gave lectures on literature. During one of them, Oswald Spengel, he praised his anti-Semitic views. And now, a new girl appears on the scene, Elsa Janke. She enters his life, and he's taken in by her passion and prudence. She teaches needlework and physical instruction. According to him, she is well-built and motherly, sweet-tempered, and he writes, "I often think of her as my mother." A relationship slowly forms, but at first he is annoyed that she will not admit to this in public. Also, often his writings are rejected by the mainly Jewish publishers in Germany. But Elsa, through a friend, manages to find him a job at Dresdner Bank. Here he is, according to his own writings, he sees the repugnant side of capitalism, as he cites the sacred speculation by the rich and influential. Elsa was now clearly talking to her friends about their pending marriage, but a point of her concern was his lame foot, her wondering if it was hereditary, something she posed to him as a question, causing somewhat of an argument, one during which she admitted to one flaw of her own, namely that she was half Jewish. It is unclear if this was the catalyst, but from this point their relationship slowly dwindled, and his interests now began to be replaced by skepticism and mistrust. It also occurs to him, at a time where most of German banks are in Jewish hands. From his writings and letters, it slowly becomes apparent, for the young Goebbels is beginning to perceive the Jewish community different, and he has now begun to identify the Jews of Germany as those benefiting from a crisis in which inflation was draining even his own paycheck." End quote. And he lamented about the Jewishness in Elsa now also. Yet despite his growing attention on the Jewish influence in Germany and German culture, he is still sending love letters to Elsa. Also, he makes notes of feels himself without close friends, he's penniless, and notes his despair in a letter to Elsa, and how he feels his father had given up on him, and that he is beyond hope, lazy and unreasonable, as he believed his father to see him. His thoughts at the time goes back to suicide. This is the low point of his life, and it would not be getting any better as he lost his job at the bank. But he told nobody at home, and continued to travel to the city every day. Inflation at this point was rampant, and the young writer was still more occupied by his own writings. He seemed to have used his writings as an escape from reality. He wrote plays and the occasional columns and papers and travel guides. His close friend Friesges had left town some time ago to work in the mines, and on one fateful day Elsa's sister witnessed Goebbels' reaction upon receiving the news that his one close friend had died in an accident there. He was clearly stricken, and wrote an eloquent essay about his friend, one published in the paper that following Christmas. From his writings it seemed clear that the young Goebbels was a man seeking a mission, a reason, a destiny. He felt himself a man on a mission, yet purpose still wondering what this mission might be. He continued to bury himself in writing plays or books, filtering in the life he had lived, the people who affected him through imagined characters. He lived the life he may have imagined wanting. As many writers, he wrote closures to life chapters he could not obtain in real life. He often wondered if Elsa thought of him as lazy, as also had been hinted by his father. A friend found him a job on the floor of the stock exchange. He would now drink occasionally, sometimes too much. Still searching for his purpose, as young men do, but faced with the constant rejections from whom he saw as Jewish editors and publishers, certainly a slow, growing seed of anti-Semitism was growing in his mind. Elsa wrote him that she felt he had taken their race differences too serious, and that his views on her Jewish heritage was the real obstacle between them. Yet at this time he would lock himself away in the small summer house his parents had built, lamenting over their letters, yearning for just one more day together. These flights to summer houses and self-analysis over relationships was to become a lifelong habit of his. In his diary he railed against the God who had made him a cripple, and also despaired over watching the injustice around him, not being able to help, something noteworthy given the seemingly self-centered writing of this young man. He wrote an entry, "Why even bother getting up in the morning? Nothing awaits me, no joy, no suffering, no duty, no job," end quote. His diary entries the next few years are rather pitiful, but can probably also be reflected by many of the other starving Germans around him at the time. The Depression made money worthless overnight, and food and work scarce. And still, as his diary entries, his much rewritten novels once again was rejected, yet again by another Jewish editor. At least once he would speak at a communist meeting in 1924. He would also drop in on one of the meetings of the Deutsche Völkische Freiheitspartei in the occupied zone. He was not impressed, and noted if only Hitler was free, as he had heard far more positive things about his Bavarian branch of this party. Yet he felt German folkish notion was a good one, but lacked charismatic, hard-working leaders. The interesting question at this time would be, what did Goebbels really believe himself at this time? Where did he stand politically? He had read the memoirs of August Bebel, the founder of the Socialist Democrat Party. From this he had concluded, for one, not lose heart, and that the real workers were in fact the real nationalists, but that the Jews had run rings around Bebel, being far superior to him intellectually. Goebbels even described himself as a communist, but in the Russian original sense. As he looked around him, all he saw was small-minded men, driven by their payday, by football and sex. And he understood why the communists hated the bourgeois, and from 1924 he began hosting political meetings, where he described the great socialist experiment in Russia, the glow from the East, as he referred to it. But the Jewish nature and influence on the Bolshevik leadership bothered him greatly. He wrote to the Russian men to banish the Jews and hold out your hands of friendship to Germany. He was, however, not an international socialist, and was greatly inspired by the great German works and inspired by Johann Sebastian Bach and Wagner's Meistersinger. On July 2nd, 1924, he would write that if he was in charge of Germany, he would pack up the lot of Jews and banish them. Now he had come round fully to the impression that the Jews were corrupting Germany. Inspired by readings of such books as Trial, he was, however, impressed by idealism and warmth by such people as Rosa Luxemburg. As he would write, "You can't change your nature," and observed, "My nature is now rather biased towards the anti-Semitics." In August 1924, Goebbels would travel to Weimar and attend his first Nazi rally. It made a great impression on him to attend the well-attended rally. In his diary he drew a swastika and noted, "It does me good to see all these young men fighting alongside me." Hitler was still in prison at this time of the rally, but Ludendorff, the World War I hero, would speak, and Goebbels would meet George Strasser, and took a liking to him. Over 30,000 followers, under the swastika flags, would march by with Goebbels looking on from a sidewalk cafe. Cheers for Hitler even in his absence made much of an impression on the young Goebbels, and here he found himself in a bar talking politics to his friends, and he began finding himself thinking Völkisch. It can be said that it was but for the toss of a coin that Goebbels landed on the right, but he did, and when he returned home he founded his own small party, Mönchengladbach. It was a National Socialist Party platform, but in the occupied area this denomination was still illegal. And in 1924 he was brought in for questioning at least once by the Belgian occupational authorities. Elsa would still enter his life on and off. He would write, "Eros next to money is what makes the world go round." He would obtain his very first typewriter. On one he would write that it was easier to master than women. He would write his first article on it, on the concepts of national and socialist, concluding, "We are nothing. Germany is everything." At this time he was clearly starting to see Hitler as the unifying center of the party, despite still having never met him. But he met with George Strasser in September, inquiring as to when Hitler might be released. He would write after in his diary of Hitler, "We are all missing him." Over the next year, Goebbels would hold 189 speeches. He was homing his talent, realizing his own strength as an agitator, and one capable of bending the audience. He would write that he had found the soul of the German working people. And perhaps self-aware of his anti-Semitic sentiments, he would begin to sign off as Dr. Paul J. Goebbels instead of Joseph. He would write for Wittgen's house. Although opposing opinions over emphasizing National Socialism as the paper wanted, Goebbels focused on all of socialism. He eventually took over as managing director for the paper. He was still not satisfied, though, with his own writings, but he improved both as a writer and as an orator. He was slowly finding himself. He was writing, it was hard-hitting, and he found a sense of purpose. Reading up to 10 papers a day, writing letters late into the night, his parents was impressed by his changes. From a broke layabout to a new, driven man. Still, of course, all unpaid for his hard work. But he was becoming famous, and as we know, that is a good start before the arrival of fortune. The 1924 elections only awarded a small number of seats to the National Socialist movement. Of the 472 seats, 32 only went to the right-wing parties. Of those, only 10 were under Gregor Strasser, who was still loyal to Hitler. It was a defeat, a battle lost, but not a war lost. The idea must and will endure, Goebbels wrote. He clearly saw the division in the parties between National Socialism and Socialism. Goebbels was still leaning towards socialism, but not international Marxist socialism. He was hoping for socialist influence on the Nationalist Party, a party now thrown into disarray as Hitler was released and began clawing back his hold on the party. But Joseph, like many others, were becoming disillusioned by the Völkische movement. As an ardent opposer to the bourgeoisie, he resigned from the paper and began working for Kaufmann. Equally as financial broke as Goebbels himself. The two men became friends. although Goebbels had a hard time finding friends, or even, to some degree, liking people. And certainly his German shepherd was a better friend to him than most people. He heard less and less from Elsa, of whom he wrote that he would like to have her as his wife, had she not been half-blooded." And despite his waning faith, he did return home for the occasional Catholic holiday. However, his brother Hans was no longer welcome, as he had married outside the Catholic faith. Thus, if nothing else would hammer home to Joseph how a marriage with Elsa would never be. He flirted occasionally with other women, but it came to nothing, and he would write, quote, "I shall be more and more lonely until I end up all alone, without love and without family." It is interesting to note that many of his lady friends subsequently parted from him heartbroken. Yet he was not the large, imposing physical specimen by any means, but the way he charmed them with literary knowledge, and through his personality and, quote, "piercing eyes," he would woo his female friends. He had clearly a persuasive personality and a charm, but yet his relationships were all dead-ended. And it seems not fully sexual in nature either. Whether this is from his Catholic upbringing, or him personally holding back, or the women simply holding back on him, is still somewhat unclear. Goebbels had joined the reconstituted party under Hitler. At some point after February 1925, Hitler had appointed Axel Ripke as Gauleiter, regional commander for North Rhineland, a friend of Karl Hauptmann, whom in turn suggested he appoint Goebbels as his manager, which he did. And soon it was noted that all the Gau meetings, Goebbels were speaking at every one of them. It was not soon after the authorities banned the organization and arrested its members. It was Goebbels who wrote the minister in charge to have the men released. But Goebbels and Ripke did not see entirely eye to eye. One wanted a bourgeoisie reform, and the other wanted a socialist revolution, and their differences became more apparent through several lengthy discussions. But Goebbels stood his ground, and as Ripke lamented, Goebbels was a dangerous man, as he believed in what he said. But for now, Hitler still had his faith in Ripke. However, Goebbels often had articles published in the party newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter, and occasionally Alfred Rosenberg would invite Goebbels to speak at large party gatherings. And despite not being a pugilist by a mile, he would often find himself speaking in the thick of party battles and street fighting with the communist opponents. Victor Lutze at times had Goebbels speak for SA commanders. It was at this time that the French pulled out of the Rhineland, and Hitler's book was published. And certainly, as Goebbels noted, he himself did not agree with much of it, and given their feud, Ripke spoke to Hitler calling Goebbels a Bolshevist. However, Goebbels did not take this quietly. He fought back and cited that Ripke had stolen from party funds, which was one of the few deadly sins not permitted within the Nazi Party. The very first time Hitler and Goebbels actually met was on July 12th, if only briefly in a beer hall. However, Ripke eventually resigned, leaving Lutze, Kaufmann, and Goebbels in charge. Soon after, Strasse came to see him. He liked what he saw, and the two men had similar beliefs. Thus, Strasse hired Goebbels on. Both thought Hitler was surrounded by the wrong people in Munich. Strasse wanted to consolidate the party and hired Goebbels to edit a new journal to this effect. It seemed a challenge against Hitler's men in Munich. But Goebbels had long been pining for a fight, and he signed on. He was immersing himself in what eventually became a split in the party, and Strasse would eventually become one of Goebbels' enemies. Kaufmann became Gauleiter in North Rhineland, a position Goebbels had hoped for, but it was not yet to be. However, the young Goebbels had gained significantly in popularity and was slowly emerging on the radar of many of the party's elites. And by editing Strasse's paper, it gave him more notoriety than somewhat made up for his slight jealousy as to still playing second to Kaufmann. But writing the journal for Struckmann gave him a national audience, and it would feature writings from other emerging leaders such as Heinrich Himmler. Here Goebbels would expound on his anti-Semitic and socialist views. He would rationalize an affection for Russia and would make his case for an alliance with a truly national and socialist Russia. He was appalled when the German Chancellor Gustav Struckmann signed a non-aggression pact with France and Belgium, guaranteed by Britain and Italy. Goebbels would see this as the lead-in to a war against Russia, one fought by German sons, as he put it, on behalf of Western capitalists. He would rail against the Germans as he saw a puppet government to the Western countries, and wrote, "Germany will become free at the moment when the 30 million of the left and the 30 million on the right make common cause, and only one movement is capable of doing this, National Socialism, and embodied in one Führer, Adolf Hitler." End quote. It was clear that Goebbels admired Strauss, who in turn let him peruse a more radical line than many in the party wanted. Certainly they were not going after Hitler, but seeking to pick off those whom they saw as parasites around him. He was now drawing crowds on his own of several thousands, even speaking to crowds mixed with the German communists. He wrote how appalling he found it that the German communists and the nationalists were fighting each other, and he personally held sympathies for the working class. He buried himself in work, constantly traveling across the country, speeches, slow trains, and more meetings. And with no family of his own to come home to, he simply worked. And still he found it hard to achieve relationships with women. But upon seeing the red light district in Hamburg, he was outraged and made it clear that this sort of mixed liaison would be swept away after the revolution. End quote. He would occasionally write his female friends, made notes of self-loathing in regards to those who were so unlucky as to love him. Also Anka he would occasionally make mention of in his diary, but made no further contact. But slowly we are beginning now to see the evolution of a master of propaganda. After one party rally, gunshots left one dead, yet in his diary he mentioned 2 gunshots. And an audience of 1,500 was noted as one of 3,000. Newspapers mentioned 1 shot fired in Essen, yet in his diary he wrote shootings. He was writing for effect, classical propaganda methods for the future he was trying it off in his diary. However popular Goebbels was becoming, according to a letter by Strauss on October 22nd, Hitler had told him of his distrust of Goebbels. This, he told Goebbels, he had initially planned on talking to Hitler about the party program later in the party conference. Now he wondered if he should quit entirely, but finished reading Mein Kampf, this leaving him with more questions as to who Hitler really was. On November 4th, 1925, he finally secured his second meeting with Hitler. It's hard to say, given how Strauss's note must have confused him, as Hitler had greeted him as an old friend. The two had spoken for some 10 minutes. Thereafter Goebbels had to leave to speak first, and for several hours to great applause, followed by Hitler, who also spoke for several hours. Goebbels was impressed with him. Writing, "The born popular leader," he had wanted to speak more with Hitler, but not on that day. However, soon after he was invited to open a meeting speaking before Hitler, again this time in Saxony, after Hitler gave him a signed portrait, one that would rest on Goebbels' desk until he finally ended his life. In November 1925, Goebbels would visit Berlin for the first time. He was on one hand impressed by the huge metropolis, yet disgusted by the political class, and referred to it as a sinful Babel. He would speak to some thousands of the small Berlin party crowd, but these were many of the party elites, and a few days later the Berlin police opened their first dossier on him. In June, Belgian occupational troops had shot dead a nationalist, Ludwig Knickmann, and on December 7th, Goebbels, keenly aware of the value of propaganda, did not miss on the opportunity, and spoke at his funeral, and 3 weeks later staged 1,500 SA stormtroopers marching silently through the snow to the spot where Knudvik had been shot. Goebbels would write 2000. They would march only to the sound of muffled drums, whereafter they marched through the most expensive area of Düsseldorf. It was not for nothing he had read Richard Wagner's The Art of Direction. Strasse tasked Goebbels with drafting a new party program, and Hitler sent him a leathered inbound copy of Mein Kampf. However, this newfound affection from Hitler did not make it impossible for Goebbels to begin to write up a party program somewhat different from Hitler's ideas, and eventually he came up with 24 points, all very anti-bourgeoisie. Although respecting private property, he saw the state nationalizing all heavy industry, and one of his parallel private projects was the writing of his political letter, The Second Revolution, not one of Hitler's favorite terms at all. Hitler was well informed as to Goebbels' debating of his suggestions and his criticism of Hitler himself, calling him petit bourgeois, quoted by Rosenberg and Strasse, two of Goebbels' future rivals and enemies. And given the future rift between Strasse and Hitler, one may wonder if the former had not had his sympathies with Goebbels' ideas already then. Indeed, after talking with Hitler, he would ring Goebbels and told him Hitler was finally coming around to their point of view, but had called a conclave between the Gauleiters to hammer things out. This, of course, left Goebbels optimistic, and perhaps led to this belief by Strasse. He was clearly surprised as he would first hear a 4-hour speech to the party locals by Hitler in which he would oppose all thoughts of opposing the princes or aristocracy, and had Goebbels understood the bigger picture at the time, he would have known these industrialists, bankers, and royals were Hitler's financial backers. Strasse backed down immediately and asked the Gauleiters to please burn Goebbels' outlines and suggestions. Now Goebbels was seen as the one who could not be trusted, and as a slippery opportunist. He was taken greatly aback by all of this. Afterwards he would write, "What kind of Hitler is this?" He now had to begin to come to terms with a party who saw the Russians as the enemy, whereas he simply had understood it to be Bolshevism. Strasse and the others around him had backed down from their confrontation, but Strasse maintained his direction, one away from that of Hitler's. But it was now the time for Goebbels to make choices, and his was to steer towards Hitler and away from Strasse, albeit slowly. He caught the new wind, and in his next writings he would emulate the dictates and direction as outlined by Hitler. In March, Hitler had invited Goebbels, Lutze, and Kaufmann to join him in Munich. Hitler sent them his luxurious limousine, his Mercedes, his private driver. They drove them to the lake of Starnberg. Hitler had the SA put up posters advertising Goebbels speaking that night, and on stage he would give him a big hug. The perfect charm offensive. Later Strasse would claim the display of wealth was what won over Goebbels. Hitler would sign over the Gau to be run by the 3 men that day, and show them around the new party headquarters. Here also Goebbels would meet Xavier Schwarz and Rudolf Hess. The next morning Goebbels called on Hitler with flowers, and the 2 men spoke frankly about politics and the future. They were finding each other. The next day they went together to Stuttgart, and where again they would both speak, and again Hitler would embrace him on stage. Goebbels would write Strasse to urgently meet with Hitler, that the 2 men would work out their differences. Later that day Goebbels would confide to his diary, "Hitler, I love you because you are great and simple at the same time." However, back at his Gau, it was in reality unfeasible for 3 men to lead it. So a vote was called, and Kaufmann won, although Lutze indicated to Goebbels that he had rigged the vote. And disappointed, Goebbels decided to leave, first to Berlin, then Munich, while deciding what to do. He spent some time in Essen, where he met one of Hitler's financial backers, Director Arnold. To his diary he confided how he observed this man's gestures when speaking. A born agitator, he noted. One could conquer the world with such a man. Women, however, continued to catch his eyes and his pen. Elsa would finally break it off with him, and he wondered in his writing if this was not indeed the time to move on to a better, less compromised woman. In writing he would lament often about his foot, not just the physical pain, but also how self-conscious he was about it. Yet despite of his apparent intellect and drive, he was still distracted by the wearing for female company, and the constant questioning when one becomes available to him. He seemingly continued to strike out with those beautiful women all around him, yet not for the lack of trying. He would once again dive back into his work and visit Hitler in Obersalzberg, where he was again taken in by Hitler, noting that the last of his doubts had vanished. Now Berlin was a political mess. The Communist Party was growing, and the NSDAP had only received 137 votes in the last local election. The current Gauleiter, Dr. Schlangen, a financial supporter of the Strasse Brothers publishing house, but he had lost his nerve for the fight. And the Strasses had begun publishing a proletarian paper selling some 300,000 per week. Goebbels was offered the job of Gauleiter of Berlin. But he was now acquiring a political instinct and was clearly on the fence. George Strasse had gotten a unanimous vote for Goebbels, and he had not noticed that Goebbels was slowly changing camp into that of Hitler's. The rift in the party was not yet clear, but it was slowly growing, and Goebbels had not forgotten the intrigue and noted, "I shall show the lot of them," and held out on accepting the appointment. He went to Bayreuth, where he managed a short fling with one of Winifred Wagner's youngest daughters. Berlin was a trouble spot, though. There were 270,000 unemployed Berliners. Constant street fightings, and the NSDAP party funds in Berlin were non-existent. Goebbels still dragged on accepting. While he was sizing up Berlin, 3 NSDAP martyrs were created in the fighting with Berlin communists. He had now held out for his financial terms, though, ensuring his pay would be paid from the Munich party office and not from the near-bankrupt Berlin Gau. And after a few more public, large speaking events, he finally accepted the title of Gauleiter of Berlin, formally on October 26, 1926, one he would hold until his death, and one he would take quite serious, as time will tell. Behind me is Werner von Braun's first test stand. Down the road is Diebner's nuclear reactor. Over there is the Maginot Line and all its amazing forts. I'm visiting them all and I'm bringing them to you. So I really appreciate you like, follow, and share what I'm doing, trying to document all these important historical locations. And if you feel like you want to watch more pictures or documents that I use for these, go to lostbattlefields.com. And if you feel like helping me out with my travels, because gasoline and travel and airfare is expensive, my PayPal is there, protectionserviceint.com. You are more than welcome, but you don't have to. I appreciate all your support and all your help, and I love seeing these locations, and I love bringing them to you.